Was Michael Penix snubbed for Offensive Player of the Year?
You are Locked On Huskies, your daily podcast on the Washington Huskies, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back into another edition of the Locked On Huskies podcast. I'm Roman Tomashoff. That's Lars Hanson. We write for Inside the Huskies with Fan Nation and Sports Illustrated. You can check out all our written work over there at si.com/college/Washington. Thank you for making this your first watch or first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. Lars, there's been I would call it an uproar, but I don't even know if that's a strong enough word for it, of on Twitter recently of Oregon quarterback Bo Nix winning Offensive Player of the Year in the Pac-12 over Michael Penix Jr. And I have a lot of thoughts on this. I don't even know if we can really call it a snub because of just pure stat padding reasons, but Bo Nix over Michael Penix, just what was your initial reaction when you saw this?
Well, it's almost like the same thing about Marvin Harrison Jr. making the Heisman finalist list, where it's like, okay, if Bo wins Pac-12 Player of the Year, Penix wins the O'Brien Award or the Heisman, or it's almost like, okay, hey, how do we balance this out, right? Because you're not going to give one quarterback all the awards, right? Because at some point, like, let's say Penix wins O'Brien, Maxwell, Heisman, and Pac-12 Player of the Year. Okay, well, he didn't have that because of that 3-game stretch after the Oregon game, or kind of in between, towards the end of the season, right? Where it's like, hey, maybe he didn't have his best games, right? Maybe he didn't play up to that level where Bo did. So, okay, you can give Bo the edge in Pac-12 Player of the Year, knowing that Penix beat him twice, so he'll probably win the Heisman, or at least maybe finish higher in the Heisman voting, and so then he'll win the Maxwell or the O'Brien Award, right? I think it's a give and take more than a snub. And then also you have to remember the coaches are the ones voting on this. That's why Brendan Rice was somehow second team, or for receiver. And it's like, wait a minute, like what are we doing here? Like Brendan Rice is good, but like I don't think anybody would look at the Pac-12 and think, oh yeah, he's one of the top 4 receivers in the conference. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that sounds.
I'm glad you brought that up, because as much as people want to call Bo Nix over Michael Penix for that a snub, Ja'Lynn Polk not being mentioned as as an All Pac-12 receiver on one of those first 2 teams is so much more of a snub, and that's just unbelievable. And yeah, he struggled for a couple of games there, but especially after the Jalen McMillan injury, he stepped up and just filled a huge role on this team. And it's not like, oh, well, the Washington guys were 13-0, so they deserve, this and that and this and that. But they definitely deserve some credit, because another guy who didn't necessarily get the love that he deserves is right tackle Roger Rosengarten, where some of these guys got like honorable mention, but that doesn't necessarily, encapsulate the work that they did this season to help the Huskies go 13-0. Roger Rosengarten was Michael Penix's blindside protector. Ja'Lynn Polk was Washington's number 2 receiver for the majority of the year, and he went for over 1,000 yards this season. Those 2 guys deserved a lot more recognition than they got. And then another one that I think deserves some extra love is Jabbar Muhammad, who was named to the second team All Pac-12, but I don't necessarily know if Kyrie Jackson had a better year than he did.
Right, and so I think it's all politics, right? Because this isn't. In a way, it's almost like the playoff committee, right? Where it's like, hey, like, are these the 4 best teams? Are these the 24 best players, or the 22 best players? Offense, defense, first team, second team, sort of thing. It's like, well, yeah, but if we give Washington and Oregon and maybe an assist to USC and a couple other positions at different schools, right? Like Damian Martinez and Jaden Ott, right? Where it's like, okay, neither of those 2 are at the top of the list in terms of teams in the conference, but they're certainly talented at their position. So it's like, okay, I can kind of see some of these. I can kind of see some others. But yeah, then there's some others that it just doesn't make any sense. But wasn't Jalen McMillan honorable mention receiver last year?
Yes.
So it's like, okay, wait a minute. The guy will lead the tied for most touchdowns in the conference, but honorable mention. Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. That checks out. Like, it's a matter of, okay, there's some of these that you're just not going to be able to do as much with, right? Where if it's the AP All-American team, then it's a different story, right? Where it's, you kind of have to take it in stride where, okay, maybe they don't win conference player of the year, conference first team, but then you're AP first team or you're whatever. There's other teams out there that it's like, hey, like, yeah, this makes sense for you to be on this list. And so I think it's a give and take. I mean, obviously there's always going to be a couple of snubs in that regard, right? There's going to be, because when you have other people voting that maybe have a vested interest in their player getting on, I mean, like the Brendan Rice example is kind of the one that kind of shines brightest, just because it's like, what are we doing here? Like,
No,
I understand some of them, but it's like I mean, like Dylan Johnson, what did he get? First, second team?
He was second team, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so at least that one makes sense, right? So I can accept that, but there's some others that it's just like you just kind of got to take the wins as you come, take the losses with the wins, and just keep it moving.
No, I agree with you there, and then just because like it's something where we look at some of these other ones where Penix is getting a lot of second team All-American selections, like CBS and The Athletic both put out their list. And I'm trying to I understand like Rome being on the first team. That's great. Like, I love that. And Michael Penix, like, where the one where it gets me is Jaden Daniels is getting first team All-American for like from CBS. I believe he got it with The Athletic too. I didn't double check that one before we hit record, but it's like, oh, but he's also all Pac-12 second team. Like, that doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's where it feels a little bit hypocritical and a little bit confusing sometimes, where you're right. A lot of this can be somewhat political, but it just feels like even though that that this team is going to the college football playoff. And I'm sure that if you ask any of these guys, which is more important, they would all say the right to play for a national championship is way more important. But for what these guys did this season, they absolutely deserve all the recognition that they can get.
Right. And it's like, I understand you don't want to punish Jaden Daniels for having 3 losses because he didn't lose those 3 games by himself, right? It's the team around him and stuff like that. But the games on the field have to matter on some level. Like, if you put Michael Penix the first team and Jaden Daniels the second team, you'd probably have an equal number of people objecting that you do with Penix, right? Where Washington fans will say, hey, how is he not first team? And then LSU fans will say, how is Jaden not first team? And it's like, well, when you look at the body of work, now, yes, I understand Michael Penix struggled against better competition when Jaden Daniels played, directional state 1, 2, and 3. So, like, there's again, his loss to Florida State, sure, give you that. But the other 2, where especially when he goes for 6 touchdowns and like 5,000 yards against Georgia State or whatever it was, and Grambling, it's like, okay, what are we doing here? Like,
right.
Why don't we go back and look at Penix lighting up Tulsa and all this? Like, okay, same thing with Bo Nix against Portland State, where Oregon puts up 81 points against Portland State. It's like, well, Washington could have put up like 75 against Tulsa if they really wanted to. Or
absolutely. They could have put up 75 on Michigan State if they really wanted to, from the way that game was played.
Right, exactly. And the fact that Dylan Morris, came in the fourth quarter in all 3 of those games, it's like, wait, okay, like, imagine if DeBoer had gone, full landing and like, hey, you know what? We're going to keep the foot on. We want all the stats. We want all this. It's like, yeah, that's just not who he is. And it's like,
I agree. And look, and just like to wrap it all up, because that's what it is, right? It's these guys deserve their recognition more than anything else. But ultimately, I'm sure that they would all trade it for a place in the national championship game in a heartbeat. And Lars, we're going to have a very, very fun discussion on the other side of this break that I know people have been clamoring for on the show. We are going to talk all about in-state recruiting right here on Locked On Huskies, because there's the good, there's the bad. And I know you and I both have some thoughts on that. But first, we're going to give a shout out to our friends over at FanDuel, because as the weather gets colder, the NFL offers stay hot on FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. That's $150 if your team wins. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use. There's a wide range of betting options, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and kick off the NFL season. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. And as I always have to do, just a reminder to everybody that Washington is still 4.5-point underdogs on FanDuel against Texas in the Sugar Bowl. And whenever we talk about recruiting, we got to give a shout out to our good friends over at LinkedIn as well, because when you're hiring for your small business, you want to have as many top tier candidates as possible to interview. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs is the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. Hiring is so easy when you have that many quality candidates. And how easy is it? In fact, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. Thankfully, with LinkedIn, the process is intuitive, quick, and easy. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even easier and quicker. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockdowncollege. That's linkedin.com/lockdowncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So Lars, we've seen it in the comments all week now, and so let's start at the top here. 4-star running back Jason Brown committed to Arizona State yesterday on Tuesday, as we record this on Wednesday, and Washington doesn't have any commits for the 2024 class from the state of Washington, and I don't necessarily think this is a bad thing. I would love to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah. So here's the thing about in-state recruiting, and I'm going to try and be gentle but fair and balanced with this. The state of Washington does produce good talent, right? Braden Platt, good talent. Hogan Hanson, good talent. Going back years, JTT, Emeka, even Savell when he came out, good prospects, right? But the problem with some of those guys is they don't always pan out for a variety of reasons, right? It's not a knock. And Southern California kids don't pan out. I mean, James Smith came from Bosco and didn't do anything. So just because you come from the state of California doesn't mean you're guaranteed to work out, just like vice versa. If you're from the state of Washington, it doesn't mean you're guaranteed to be a bust, right? So there's plenty of players that have come out of the state that have been good and done well for both the University of Washington and other programs that they've chosen to go to. But when you're looking at, and Kalen DeBoer has said this numerous times, where you're always going to start on the West Coast, right? Washington, Oregon, and California. They have Elias Johnson out of Oregon. Okay, that's cool. That's fine. But when you look at who would they have taken in the state, it's a matter, you're kind of splitting hairs at some positions and then at other, like, so for example, Hogan Hanson committed to Michigan to play tight end as a 4-star out of Bellevue High School, I believe.
Yep.
Committed early on in the process, relatively speaking, it wasn't like he was a late addition like Jason Brown is, but Washington beat out Arkansas and a number of other SEC and Big 10 and Big 12 schools for Decker DeGraff. So both of them are 4-star tight ends, right? Both of them great prospects. Okay, if you don't get the 4-star in your state, you have to get a 4-star somewhere else, right? So Nick Sheridan did that. So I think that's I
believe Decker's still rated as a 3-star, but that's underrated because that's a really, really good player.
I was going to say, but at times I think he's been a 4-star. Like, I've seen him floated in that category. So the point being, it's not right. Well, they also fit a narrative, right? So, but it's a matter of, okay, if you're looking at those two, let's just say you're breaking even, right? Okay, they might be different players in terms of their style of play at tight end, but for what Nick Sheridan wants, if he wants an all-around tight end and Hogan Hanson's were a receiving tight end, like let's say Hunter Bryant was, right? Where Hunter Bryant was a much better pass catcher than he was a blocker. Okay, well, you take the better player for your system. That doesn't mean Hogan Hanson's not a great player. That just means for what Washington wants to do, there you go. And also, with both teams going to be in the Big Ten next year, there's a bonus, right? Where, okay, if you're a kid from the state of Washington, if you don't go to Washington, you can still play in a big time conference. There's something to be said about not every kid from the state of Washington that is very talented should go to Washington, right? And I know that sounds like kind of backwards logic, especially from somebody covering the University of Washington, but just because you're an in-state kid doesn't mean it's a good fit, right? There's some kids where, hey, you know what, I have a relationship with this coach, or I used to live here, or I have family, et cetera, et cetera. There's always a variety of factors. And then you go to EJ Cameron versus DeMarcius Davis. They're kind of similar styled-ish, right? But I remember talking to Davis after he committed, And Grubb had been in on him for over a year, even when Camion committed. So I think it was something along, hey, let's kind of just see how these guys turn out. And especially with Washington still going to go for a portal player, right, at quarterback. So there's a few other factors that kind of play into this. And then when you look at Jason Brown, that's the key one we're talking about here, where he goes to Arizona State. I don't think we're going to say Arizona State beat out Oregon and Washington for that, right? That's no slight to Jason Brown, but just the fact of the matter is Arizona State kind of fell into his lap, right? He fell into their lap more so than Washington's, lost out on the player.
So I agree with you there, and I want to take everybody through real quickly the major contributors on the depth chart on this team from the state of Washington. If we look at the offensive side, we can look at the tight ends, Devin Culp and Jack Westover, who've played a role in this team. We can look at left guard Nate Kalepo, where they've all contributed. You wouldn't necessarily point them out as stars on the offensive side of the ball, but they've definitely contributed to the offense. And then we can flip over to the defensive side. And you can have MJ Ale, who is a converted offensive lineman who was more playing defensive tackle out of need, and he's been really good. I'm not knocking him in any way, shape, or form. But that's another 3-star kid. And then at linebacker, 2 underrated 3-stars, Alfonso Tupatala and Carson Bruner. And the last one is a walk-on who earned his scholarship, Michelle Powell in the nickel. Those are the guys from the state of Washington who have had a major impact on this team. Correct me if I'm wrong. And so this isn't just saying, and it's not saying, Washington doesn't need to take any kids in state, because that's not how this works. But it's a matter of finding the right fit. And I feel like it's very clear through the first 2 classes that it's not like Washington is letting a lot of these top kids in state get away, but they're just choosing to focus their resources out elsewhere in terms of their talent evaluation, where it's very clear that they want California to be the center, the pipeline of it all. Arizona has a lot of really, really good talent. They're doing a really good job at recruiting the state of Arizona. Look at who was moving into the top 100, edge rusher Noah Carter. That kid can play. I love watching Noah Carter's film. But it's a matter, not a matter of, they're turning their back on in-state kids either. But it's just they are finding the right kids to fit this system. And I'm sure we're going to see some more of that down the line. There are a couple kids in 2025, which you and I are going to talk a lot about on the Friday show, that I'm really interested in. I think that would be a really good fit in the system, but it's just a matter of they seem to be very particular about what, and I'm talking about the staff when I say this, about what they want. And it feels like in this class in particular, there weren't a lot of, and I mean, we can point at some other contributors to Washington in the past, where we look at a guy like Joe Tryon, underrated 3-star recruit. Taylor Rapp, borderline 4-star in terms of talent coming out of high school, but underrated in terms of valuation. And there are so many examples like that you can point to on this team in the past, where it's, like the kids that from Washington that actually turned out to be really good sometimes were some of the underrated players. A peak example of this is Jacob Eason, where there's, Jacob Eason, 5-star quarterback, top 10 player in the country. Didn't necessarily turn out the way that it was supposed to. I'm not saying that every player, every 5-star in the state is Jacob Eason, but it just feels like there needs to be a little bit more in terms of talent evaluation, because it sometimes feels like kids in the state can be pumped up really early, and then they go on the national circuit and then just not necessarily be portrayed in the same light by the end of their recruitment. And a prime example of that is Ascendra Afua from O'Day, who is committed to Texas A&M, where it's when he was a freshman, it was, this kid's going to be like the number 1 player in the country. He's going to be like the top offensive lineman in America. He's going to go to Alabama or Georgia, wherever he wants. And that hasn't necessarily been the case. And I'm not knocking the kid when I say that, but it's just in terms of the evaluation seems to be very, very high early on. And then other ranking sites will seem to just kind of catch up, or other kids will just kind of have a little bit of a later breakout. And then some of the bigger schools will say, well, no, we're going to turn to that kid instead of the kid from Washington. And it seems like Washington's talent evaluation is saying the same thing. Like what Courtney Morgan and his recruiting staff are saying is something similar.
Well, I think that's a great point. And I think also kind of diving even a little bit deeper below that is something, and this is somewhat unrelated, but it ties together. Where Kirby Smart made a point where they look at the portal, like what's their portal likelihood, right? Where if you sign a kid out of high school, how likely is he to be in the portal in a year or two versus, hey, is he a guy that like, so a Denzel Boston, right? Where he can come in, kind of get some early playing time, work his way up, take a step back this season in terms of snaps per game, but then next year double it up, right? Go junior year, senior year and do whatever and things like that. Garrett Hatchett, same thing, where maybe he might have struggled in a couple of games this season. He comes back next season, boom, locks down the right guard position. So there's a number of different things that can kind of play a role in that. But the reason why I say that is Washington wants to invest their resources, strategically. So that means, hey, if we take 5 kids in the state of Washington, probably 3 of them will want to transfer for more playing time within 18 months, right? Like that's just kind of how it is, right? And so why would we do that when we could save those 3 or 4 spots, give 1 or 2 to an in-state kid, like a Hatchet or a Boston, a Jacob Lane, where we can see the production, we can see the projection, but then also supplement it with guys in the transfer portal. And I think that's the ultimate key here is if they're going for a running back this year, bringing this whole thing back to Jason Brown, probably going for the portal. So like it's right. And if you're Washington, and this is not a fight to Jason Brown. This could go for Oregon. This could go for a number of schools where. Do you want to take a chance on a 4-star who others have maybe passed on or said, hey, like we'll think about it, but it's not a guarantee? Or do you want a kid who's played 2-3 years in college football looking for one final year to put it all together like Dylan Johnson did coming to Washington this year? And you take the latter every day and twice on Sunday. Right. And so you take the other one, you take the latter every day and twice on Sunday. That's an easy choice. And so it's not a slight to the high school kids. It's just with the availability of the portal, coaches would be ignorant not to use it.
Right. And especially a team like this, where the whole thing, especially when we talk about the 2023 season, it was, well, this team looks like it wants to make a push for a national championship. They're doing just that. And taking a whole bunch of players from the state of Washington might not necessarily always be the best answer for that. So I agree with you there. I think that's a really great point. And Lars, we're going to talk about some pro Husky success. Shout out to Jake Browning, Offensive Player of the Week. We got a whole lot of that here on Locked On Huskies. But first, we got to send a message to our good friends over at PrizePicks, because PrizePicks is the most fun you can have, winning up to 25 times your money this football season, and now you can play during basketball season too. All you have to do, select 2 or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats, and place your entry. One of the coolest things about PrizePicks is their reboot policy, so that your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured for football and basketball games. If you have a player who exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player is rebooted. And PrizePicks is the only daily fantasy sports platform with an injury insurance policy. PrizePicks is really simple to play. You can make your picks and submit your entry in less than 60 seconds. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of players and stat types are just some of the things that make PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Do you want to get on the action? Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnCollege and use code LockedOnCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. PrizePicks is daily fantasy sports made easy. So you and I were talking about this piece before the show. First of all, I have to lead this off by saying Vita Vea has been one of the best defensive tackles in football this year. Shout out to Vita Vea. He should be an all-pro. Talk about a guy like that. Talk about somebody who you and I discussed on the show a couple weeks ago, and Trent McDuffie, who didn't like my choice of Beanie, but is one of the best corners in the NFL. Shout out to him for that. Jake Browning, Offensive Player of the Week in the NFL, in the AFC. And so some of these Washington Huskies have done a really great job of just tearing up the league this year, doing a fantastic job in the NFL. And we're going to see a lot more of that next year when we get into all our NFL draft coverage in the offseason and everything like that. But one of the most interesting things that Kalen DeBoer, we've seen him do is really make sure that all the alumni are involved, which was not something that we could say about Jimmy Lake. And now that we're seeing all this level of success at the professional level too, do you think that that's something that can just help trickle down and maybe help in recruiting and maybe just help Washington become a bigger brand as they make this move to the Big Ten?
You're telling me Marcus Peters didn't have a good relationship with Jimmy Lake? I'm shocked, but that's beside the point. No, I think, well, so interestingly enough, and I didn't believe this was true at the time, but Nick Saban said schools can't use former players to entice recruits or directly, impact recruiting. So from that standpoint, obviously they can't do that, but without question, if you see these former players on the sideline, or if you're a recruit and you see like Julio Rodriguez on the sideline, right? For the Oregon game and things like that, just having that presence both in the city with your alumni and just stars in general, I think certainly that's always going to help your program. I don't think it's necessarily like that's why certain kids will come here, but I do think their parents would think, hey, it's cool to see these guys come back with this new coaching staff that they don't even have any relationships with, and be close with them or be tight with them. And so I think it more or less speaks to that part in the character side of the coaching staff than it does the actual impact of like Marcus Peters being back around the team and things like that, and Trent McDuffie coming back. It's not going to entice William Lee to sign with Washington, right, out of Kansas State in the portal, but seeing that development and saying, hey, when I go to Washington, I can always come back, as a player or as a former player and always be welcome back. That's kind of like it's a good indicator, and that is a factor that helps. I just don't think it would be the key factor, but I mean, certainly any good publicity is something you want. You don't want to be known as a school that, hey, well, you had great college players, but they didn't do anything in the NFL. It's like, okay, well, that's not necessarily the case for Washington anymore. They might not have a ton, right? That, Taylor Rapp got hurt and things like that. So there's always going to be things that come up, but, Joe Tryon and Vita being on the same defense,
Greg Gaines there too.
Right. And so with all the talk of all the Georgia players going to Philadelphia, it's like, well, hey, what if that? And I think the unique thing to your point is also not just the guys coming back, but as you mentioned, moving forward, Rome and Ja'Lynn and Troy and Roger and all these guys, Penix and all these guys and Dylan and all these guys going into the league on offense. Washington's kind of been known as a defensive school for a while. Jake Browning is like, hey, I'm still here. Like, I'm still, I'm that guy, despite what Mina Kimes wants to say. But that shout out to Mina for that motivation. But having,
I still appreciated the tweet. He's a fantastic punter.
No, I get. So somebody commented me that when I said that she should have punted on the original take. Again, I was a big fan of Jake Browning as a pooch punter. But again, it's more of like that makes him an athlete, not a bad quarterback, right? Like I think Jake just kind of needed
straight up attacking me right here,
and especially with Jake, just the way that his shoulder kind of ended at Washington, he kind of needed that extra kind of maybe year or two to be like, hey, you know what? We know you're a cerebral mind. We know you can read, almost like Dylan Morris, right? Where it's like slightly better in terms of productivity, but same, hey, you want that guy in your quarterback room. And then if he can kind of work back up and get his shoulder good and prove that he can do it, yeah. It's like Brock Purdy in San Francisco. If you put enough guys around him, Jake's good enough to find those guys and make it work. He's got the touch. He knows the offense. Yeah, I mean, I don't see why you that would be a bad thing. But I'm on that line. I remember asking Troy Taylor, the Stanford head coach, about Jake Browning at media day. He's like, Jake's an old soul, but I don't think he's going to be a quarterback coach. I think he's got some juice left in the NFL still. And then to see Jake do what he did on Monday Night Football, which is so cool. So I think all that stuff and this new influx of offensive talent will certainly help DeBoer even more so moving forward than just getting Marcus Peters and some other guys around the program back, which also is important, but not as massive as the new guys.
No, I agree with you there, but it's one of those things where we've seen where, these players, some of these alumni are coming back to speak at practices and doing some of these different things. And that's something where if say a recruit is still at that practice, they can just say, oh, wow, look at, I can learn from a guy like this if I come to this school. Those are some of the little things that matter sometimes where it's, oh, wow, that's a top 5 defensive tackle in the NFL. And just having those kinds of moments are things that can make a difference. And that seems like, and that was more the reason that I know we wanted to make sure we talked about this, is that's something that Kalen DeBoer really seems to understand, is all the little things that he has done to make sure that this program is at its peak, because he knows what this program, and it's something you and I have talked about. This could be a top 10, top 15 job nationally when everything is hitting on all cylinders. And it seems like it's starting to get back to that point right now. And as long as Kalen DeBoer is here, that's something that will continue to happen. And we could see this almost a takeover, because it's something that I know I've made the point on the show before, where I think that there's a legitimate possibility the Huskies could have the most draft picks of any college team in this next draft. And that's something where it could almost be like a Husky Renaissance of sorts, where it's, oh, wow, look at what Kalen DeBoer is producing. And while he didn't necessarily recruit these guys, which is, I know, a huge thing on Oregon Twitter right now, it's, oh, well, these aren't his guys. These are all Peterson guys. That doesn't matter, because he developed these guys. His coaching staff is what got them to where they are right now. And showing that going forward on Sundays is something that will absolutely trickle down to the rest of the program.
Well, and not only that, but it's a continuation on the already that DeBoer is playing Sark again in the Alamo in the Sugar Bowl. Peterson built his success with Sarkisian guys. Now, yes, he got Browning and that those were his guys, and eventually he got the Vitas and the Trents and everything that. But it started with Shaq Thompson and all those guys in that Fort, Kevin King and all those guys initially laying that foundation. Now he got better with his guys, right? But it took him a couple of years to get up to that point. Given what Sark inherited as an 0-12 team, Sark paved the way for Peterson to pave the way for DeBoer. Like that's the kind of ascent that you've gone up. I'm going to just omit the middle coach in between because it's not worth mentioning. The fact that, yes, like Peterson, these are a lot of Peterson's guys, but DeBoer is Peterson-esque, where he knows, hey, I'm getting 4 stars coming in, 4 stars in the portal, and I'm coaching up 3 stars, right? Like Denzel Boston. So he's doing it exactly the way Peterson did and just having more success early on.
Right. Lars, as always, thank you so much for being here. Thank you to all the everydayers for tuning in. We really do appreciate your support as we just continue to try to build this channel in the off season. We've got so much more recruiting stuff for you. Stay tuned for a full just 2024, 2025 recruiting extravaganza type episode is the best way to put it on our Friday show. But until then, and if you just, you don't want to miss it, make sure you hit subscribe wherever you get your podcast. So that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music. We are there. We are everywhere. As I said, we are updating this channel every single day with new content. Make sure that you stick around for whatever that might be, because we're going to have so much fun stuff for you, especially after the season and of course, through the Sugar Bowl, through a potential national championship. There is so much, so make sure you stay right here with Locked On Huskies. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you on Friday.